Thanks to all of you who have stayed for the entirety of the afternoon. Our conversation is going to turn now, and actually, it's actually just, I should say, more accurately, is going to continue with what can be done. We've been hearing chapter and verse about the barriers to change, but I think we're here today because even though we have people with competing interests and priorities, everybody does seem to be in agreement that things need to change. Our panelists for this discussion represent a variety of viewpoints and stakeholders, so let me introduce them now. Tom Bannon, who's the CEO of the California Apartment Association. Program change, the boss showed up, Robbie Hunter, president of the State Building and Construction Trades Council. Matt Regan, who's the Senior Vice President for Public Policy at the Bay Area Council. Mark Stivers, who's Executive Director of the California Tax Credit Allocation Committee. And Roger Valdez, who is Director of Smart Growth Seattle and a contributor to Forbes. So welcome to all of you. And give me just a second here and I'll join you. So I've said your titles, but I often feel that kind of who you are and who you represent is sort of buried sometimes in those official words. So I want to just to get our bearings and understand the perspectives really represented on this panel. I'd like to start by asking each of you first to place yourselves on this issue. Who are your stakeholders? And then from where you sit, what are the crucial first steps we need to take to get the change you think we need? And Tom, I'll start with you.
Okay, delightful. Thank you. Well, our stakeholders are obviously the members of our association. We have about 15,000 members that range from the very small independent rental owner who owns a single family home and rents it out, all the way up to Equity Residential, who was here earlier today. I think the challenge for everybody is you got to find an answer for the housing situation. Our members basically provide a lot of housing, but they're not providing enough.
And so a crucial first step would be?
I think a crucial first step is for there to be recognition that there is in fact a housing challenge and that the only way you're going to solve that is with supply.
Okay. Robbie?
Well, the state building trades, we represent 400,000 construction workers in California, 62,000 apprentices that are just about all graduates or GED out of high schools in California. We're probably the largest block of blue-collar workers left. We're not making steel here no more. We're not making autos. Largely the fabrication of airplanes have moved out of state. So we're a significant sector of the blue-collar middle class, and we have the same issues that most of these people have. We're not at the bottom, we're not at the top. We have a large workforce that cannot afford housing, and it's a big issue for us.
And so, crucial first step?
Well, the elephant in the room really is low wages. I just came back from Australia. The minimum wage in Australia is $22. They got some of the highest rates in the world, maybe the highest, of home ownership. You cannot drive people's wages into the ground as houses rise and expect them to be able to afford an apartment or certainly not a house. So we're going two different directions at the same time. So that's the biggest issue I see.
Matt?
The Bay Area Council is a 72-year-old organization. We were founded right after World War II by the leading titans of Bay Area industry. It was sort of Henry Kaiser and the Bechtels and the Chevrons of the world. And their vision was to create an economy that would be the envy of the world in the post-war era. And we like to think that it did a pretty good job. It is, and our job at the Bay Area Council ongoing, representing about 300 of the region's largest employers, all sectors, from tech to healthcare, public and private education establishments, construction companies. Many of Robbie's members work for members of ours. And our job is to maintain the status in the Bay Area as the best place in the world to live and work. And the first step in solving this housing crisis, I think, is discovering what the problems really are. And I think that's why days like today are incredibly valuable. We all come to this issue with different perspectives, and we view it through the lens of perhaps the silos that we live and work in. And the fact that we're all here from those different silos and having this conversation in this format, I think, is incredibly valuable. I've learned a lot, and I hope by the end of the day, Assemblymember Chu will be able to get a few of us locked in a room and fix this.
Oh, well, we're going to put the metaphorical locks on right now. That's the purpose of this session. Mark, what about you?
Yeah, as Executive Director of the Tax Credit Allocation Committee, I mean, our stakeholders are the developers of affordable rental housing, and then the thousands of families of low-income families who reside in that. But previously, I spent 18 years at the legislature, and I really think of my constituency still as the entire state of California, the people who live here, the businesses who do want to work here and who want to come here. And to me, that's really what we need to sort of focus on, is how do we serve all of California. I'm going to go 3 first steps, because as I've thought about this over the years, I mean, I think there needs to be fiscal incentives for local government so that they so they're incentivized to approve the housing. At the same time, you need to sort of overcome some of the NIMBY pressures, and you need to do that by reforms to the process that sort of give less weight to the NIMBY sentiment and more weight to sort of the sentiment that we need to have housing built from a state perspective. And then thirdly, that there is, as was discussed, there's a segment of the market that will never be served by private builders, that you need to have additional subsidy to be able to meet that need. We right now build about 7,000 units a year of newly constructed affordable rental housing. The need's like 60,000, and so we're getting farther and farther behind every single year, and that's just not a recipe for success either.
Mm-hmm. Roger?
I'm Roger Valdez. I'm Director of Smart Growth Seattle, and we're an advocacy organization that represents market rate builders, developers, and building operators, owners. We advocate for more housing of all different types all over the city of Seattle for all levels of income. I think the biggest, I'm amazed at how complicated we make this problem. It's pretty simple. I think Mac pointed it out. You just need to build more housing. If you had a bread shortage, I'm going to bring out the parables. If you had a bread shortage and there were 10 loaves of bread and 100 people wanted them, would you punish the baker? Would you tax the baker? Would you drag the baker out into the street and beat him? Would you, charge the baker to bake more bread? No. You'd say, make more bread, baker, and you wouldn't slice the loaves thinner and thinner and thinner. Housing is probably the only product that I can think of in the market that is treated the way that it is treated. We think nothing of saying, if you don't have a lot of money, you ought to drive a cheaper car. Somehow or another, when it comes to housing, there's this sense it's an entitlement. So we need to look at price, as I think someone pointed out earlier. It's pretty simple. It's a measure of supply and demand. If the price is high, it means there's not enough supply to meet the demand. Simple as that. Secondly, does everybody pay 30% of your income, gross income for housing? Your blank stares. Do you? You pay more or less? If everyone in the United States paid exactly 30% of your gross income for housing, poof, the housing crisis is over. That's the way the federal government, local government, state government, that's the way we think of it. It's a bad definition, doesn't work, and because we don't define it appropriately, we cannot solve the problem with that horrible definition. As Robbie pointed out, a lot of this comes down to wages. So if we're measuring things by how much we're paying by gross income, we're forgetting that sometimes it's wages, sometimes it's other costs. What's wrong with paying 40% if I choose to pay 40%? Finally, we have to stop treating housing like it's an impact. That's what's causing the problem. It isn't an impact. It's unicorn kisses, okay? It's magic, and we should be promoting it and treating it like it is, like that. And what we're treating it like is like it's a scourge. And so that's why we're getting the regulatory environment that we have.
So let's accept Roger's premise that it's not that complicated, and let's borrow from the previous panel's idea that, you know, solutions can be bold or they can be incremental. And so my question to each of you then is, you know, is there low-hanging fruit? Is there an incremental, Robbie?
Bring back the redevelopment agencies. It was one of the most successful programs in California or any state that has it. It works. We were building 30, 40, 50, 60 projects a year in LA County with the redevelopment agencies helping the developers get them off the ground. And it all stopped when we killed the redevelopment agencies.
Tom,
that's a low-hanging
okay.
fruit right there.
Are you agreeing with that, or
Yeah.
are you just listening and
No, I mean,
shaking your head?
well, I mean, there's no question that in order to build the affordable housing, there is clearly a finance issue today. But I also think we need to recognize that it's not just a finance issue. I mean, there is a cultural issue within California that was talked about earlier. And I think we got to keep in perspective that we talked about giving, elected officials some cover, but we've got the initiative process, we've got the recall process. And originally that was intended to address the abuses of the railroads. Today, you've got the initiative and the recall process that I would argue to some degree is an abuse of the development of additional new housing. That needs to be addressed. Nobody in their wildest imaginations ever anticipated that the initiative process in California would create this incredible participatory democracy. And whether you're for it or whether you're against it, the reality is that's not going to change. And so from our perspective, it's a finance issue, I totally agree, particularly for working class families and low income families, but it's a bigger issue than that. We have got to somehow address the culture, because what's happened is technology has enhanced this culture of engagement. And by the way, there's nothing wrong with engagement, but I think the engagement has to be somehow framed, because if you have engagement without a frame, you never accomplish anything.
Betsy, may I jump in a
Please.
second? Low-hanging fruit in these housing conversations are difficult to find. We've created this Rube Goldberg structure of permitting and financing housing, and there are irresistible objects and movable objects and irresistible forces, rather, at play here, which have made it for generations incredibly difficult. I agree with Robbie. The loss of redevelopment was a huge loss, but even with redevelopment in play, we were way behind national averages in terms of housing production. We were still 2.5 times the national average to buy a home, 40% above national averages in rents. I mean, so even with redevelopment, it still was nowhere near enough. The political problems that we've discussed at length today are the primary causes of the problem. And so we at the Bay Area Council, we looked at, what can we play at in the margins a little bit that could make a difference, that doesn't tackle CEQA, that doesn't tackle local control, all the big, or Prop 13, all of the big immovable objects. And we came up with an idea working with some folks at UC Berkeley, Carol Galante and Karen Chappell, accessory dwelling units. The analogy I like to use is when traffic planners look at a freeway that's congested, and they go, how do we get more throughput on that freeway? Mm-hmm. Well, most of those cars have one person in them. Let's put more people in those cars, and we build carpool lanes, and we'll get more throughput in the freeway. In California, we have more empty bedrooms per capita than any state in the union. We have millions of empty bedrooms. Homes, Prop 13 prisoners, I call them, senior citizens living in big homes. They can't afford to move for tax reasons, and they have all of this unused living space. So We created I see Evita Chavez here from Senator Wachowski's office, our bill author. Working with Senator Wachowski and some other stakeholders, a bill that would allow homeowners to much more easily permit accessory dwelling units, as they're known, within their homes. Vancouver, Washington, for example, has about 1,000 of these being created a year. Over a third of single-family homes in Vancouver, British Columbia, not Vancouver, Washington, have accessory dwelling units. A third of their homes. If we did that in the Bay Area, it would be we did just 10% of single-family homes in the Bay Area. That would be 150,000 units of housing, which is affordable by design. They only cost, they cost a quarter of what a traditional apartment would cost to build. So that's one low-hanging piece of fruit that doesn't eat off anyone's plate, if you will. It doesn't challenge any of the big stakeholders that are sort of in the respective corners in this housing conundrum. And the governor signed it just this week, and we're working with our stakeholder friends to try and promote it to homeowners, to cities, to try and get as many people to try and build these as possible.
Yeah. Other things that are doable, something you wanted to recommend?
There's not a lot of low-hanging fruit that has a huge impact. I think that's the challenge here. But one of the things that comes to my mind is just the enforcement of the laws that we have, right? I mean, we have I think a very strong housing element law here in California. A lot of cities comply. We probably have 10 to 20% of cities that don't really comply with housing element law, and I used to calculate the chances of them being sued as about 1%. If you increase that percentage, there's more likelihood that more of them will feel inclined to comply with the law or forced to. And then, the next level are things that, I think the thing, as I've heard of these discussions over the years, the thing that's easiest to build political support around is sort of resources, whether it is resources for building affordable housing directly or resources for incentivizing local governments to approve market rate and all types of housing. You can find political will to do that, or you can find political consensus to do that, but then it's hard to find the money to do so. Either you need to redirect existing resources or you need to raise revenues, both of which can be difficult for other reasons. So it is hard to find low-hanging fruit, but those are the things that seem to be either the easiest or have the most political consensus around them.
Roger, this is your premise. Anything you want to add to the list you gave us?
I think what makes this difficult is it's a conceptual problem. It's a conceptual problem and a political problem, which means that you have to sort of get into the realm of ideas. And so I agree, there's probably not a lot of low-hanging fruit. If we could get beyond the conceptual problem, I think where we would go first is we would decrease the barriers to market, to produce more housing, which means, deregulating housing. I think it's really important to point out that developers and builders, at least the ones I work with, don't want more zoning. That's sort of, I used to think that 20 years ago was that we ought to just give out zoning or sell zoning. What they want is certainty. And they want to be able to, and housing, I was criticized for being, Roger, housing is bananas, Valdez. But it is like bananas. The difference, though, is that if I'm selling bananas and the demand for bananas spikes, I can increase my prices. If the demand goes down, I can lower it. With housing, you're looking at 6, 12, 18 months to get the product to market, and if the market changes, you're either left with something that's underpriced or overpriced.
Maybe in Seattle, 6, 12, 18 months, not in California.
Well, but that's because what you've done here is you've taken away by right development, and now you don't even have the ability to just build to the zone. So and that's what's happening with our state as well, in our city, is it is going to become 36 months. And the only people that can hold land for 36 months are giant corporations. So we have a self-fulfilling prophecy where only giant corporations can build housing, when today, at least in Seattle, we have a lot of small, medium-sized builders. So, the low-hanging fruit is just cut loose all the dead weight that's holding back the time of production. And especially in California, just that buy right thing is crucial. You have to be able to build to the zone to create predictability for the market.
So I hear you saying, by and large, not a lot of low-hanging fruit. So new premise, no progress without compromise. So imagine you all are a task force that's been charged with producing a collective solution. We have a variety of interests and constituencies represented on this stage. What do you ask of each other, specifically? What would you give to get?
I think there's one important constituency that's not on this table, on this dais, and not here today. They've been talked a lot about today, and that's homeowners who, I mean, if you look at the macroeconomics of this housing market, it's not greedy developers who are pulling all the value out. It's actually existing homeowners. You know, the last number of years, you know, the homeowners in San Francisco have been seeing multiple billion-dollar price appreciations, you know, collectively of their home values. And what we've done in effect is we've created a system where the last person in the door has to pay for all the services, because the homeowners have said, you know, we're done paying taxes. We've passed Prop 13. We're not going to pay any fees either. We've got Prop 218 for that. And then we're going to make sure that the next person that comes along that we're going to grant the privilege to live in our community will pay for our schools and our fire stations and our parks and So, you know, I like to say, you know, quote my favorite Joe Bidenism. It says, you know, don't tell me what your priorities are. Show me your budget and I'll tell you what your priorities are. We tax housing to pay for everything. So when people say, oh, housing's a priority in our community, it's like, no, it's not. It's the last thing on your priority list if you gouge housing to pay for everything else. We tax housing to pay for housing. I mean, I'm not an economist, but I work with a few economists, and there's a very simple, basic premise in economics. The more you tax something, the less of it you get. But we use tax policy to stop people from smoking. We use tax policy to encourage families. We give tax credits for kids and for mortgages. But we also use tax policy to stop the production of housing. And so until we stop using housing as a slush fund to pay for everything else, we're going to continue to get less and less of it. So we need to find a way to stop that, and we need to find a way for existing homeowners to start paying their fair share.
Okay, well, Roger, you want to say something?
I just
and
want
Mark,
to echo.
I imagine you might have an answer.
I want to applaud that comment, because you know, taxes are, you know, we use taxation to generate revenue for public benefit, to incentivize or disincentivize certain things, and to redistribute income or wealth. And when you tax housing or burden it to make more housing, it's absurd on its face. You can't compromise with like gravity or, you know, things like that. You can't compromise with supply and demand. I would ask Mark, if we were negotiating this, I'd say I need the low-income housing nonprofits to go with me to legislators and to at the city, state, federal level, and say, lower our barriers and our costs and our transaction costs. And I used to be a nonprofit housing developer, and we paid way more on the front end for housing to build it, and than for-profit developers do. So the unit, and we could argue, this is a whole separate conference, but the cost to build subsidized affordable housing is enormous. And a lot of that has to do with the barriers that we've set in front of ourselves to build it. So, and many of those are shared with private developers. So if we went in together and said, look, you need to eliminate design review, eliminate a lot of the other sort of regulatory barriers, that would benefit nonprofits as well as market rate developers. And I think it would make the subsidy dollars go further, which would be an appeal to taxpayers that's saying, instead of getting 2 subsidized units, you'd get 4, but you'd also get 10 market rate units too, which goes back to the issue of supply.
So, Mark, Roger's negotiating with you. What do you?
Well, I agree with that sentiment, and I think, you know, we at the Tax Credit Committee have done what we can to reduce costs that we impose on developers. I think, you know, a lot of the costs are outside of our control. I mean, there was a cost study done a couple years ago where the long drawn-out entitlement process adds 7% to the cost. You know, design reviews, sometimes you need to gussy up your building so you can get through the local entitlement process and deal with the neighbors. That all adds cost, all those kinds of things. So I absolutely in concurrence with that. I think the one group, you know, what we've talked about a lot here is that it's the local entitlement process that it largely is where the barrier is, and yet the local governments aren't here on this panel. And so I think, you know, that would be someone I would bring in. And in terms of, we need to ask of them sort of how can we undo these barriers that are created at the local level? But I think we at the state level need to be willing to give on the fact that, again, we need to make housing pay more for itself and make it more attractive. I like to think of the analogy of if local governments had half the incentive to go after housing as they do now for retail uses, it would be a very different outcome. The local elected officials would have an incentive to override some of the NIMBY opposition that they have. The NIMBY opposition is never going to go away. It's always going to be there. But you could mitigate it if you would make the housing financially attractive, and the local governments would be sort of torn. Right now, I'd like to think of it as we have both feet in the hole. You're fighting on two fronts at the same time with no support. And I think if we could change that, it would be great. So I would ask the local governments that, how do we remove a lot of these barriers, but I would like to give to them some ways of making housing financially more attractive.
Mm-hmm. Robbie, you're on the stage with business and government and developers. Negotiate.
Okay, so Roger, you say that on affordable housing, your costs are so much higher. What is that? What's the cost to make it higher?
Labor.
Okay. Now we're down to the crutch of it.
And so,
you said labor. So I'm a developer in the outlying areas building housing. I'm using cash payment, no workers' comp, underground economy workforce, $200 a day, 2 electricians to wire a house. How does that help the state of California? You're talking to a guy that spent 35 years in construction that represents plumbers. Our average person makes $54,000 a year to support a family in California. They come out of the Catholic high schools in San Francisco. They can't afford to live there. They come out of Oakland, they come out of Richmond, they come out of Wilmington. By right was a plan to cut those workers off at the knees, and that was a part of the reason by right came down. So you can't use a housing agenda, a shortage of housing, to undermine working people and blue-collar workers and a little bit that's left of the middle class. And that's one of the reasons by right went down. The other one was it was a scam to undercut CEQA. Okay, now the state of California sent a survey out to all of the departments that had approvals in all the cities, and they give them a list of 30 things that said, mark off the things in your department sees that hurts development the worst. CEQA wasn't even in the top 10. But it's like the deregulation of the electric grid. Enron led it, but they had their own agenda. It's like the deregulation of Wall Street. You know who led that deregulation and what they did. So deregulation isn't the best thing. Smart deregulation is good. And working people were not at the table for by right. And that's one of the reasons it went down. And that's one of the reasons the teachers weren't there and we weren't there and the real affordable housing people weren't there, and why the poverty lawyers weren't there, why Herb Weston that heads the City Council of Los Angeles, who sits there and looks at 100 affordable units where people in low income are living that's going to get torn down, with 30 people that have lived there in their 90s and their 80s that have nowhere to go and families that have nowhere to go. And he says to the builder, you're going to find housing for these 30 old people and you're going to give these families $10,000 each and find them somewhere else to live. That all disappeared with by right. And that's the reason by right went down, including wiping away the ability to get decent wages for a plumber and an electrician. People put their own agenda on the affordable housing crisis and trying to ramrod it through in California. And that's why I asked you affordable housing. The cash payment and the slavery of construction workers living in their cars is not the way to build affordable housing. For one thing, that's not what's passed on to the people. The people that buy these $600,000 homes are not getting the benefit of the saving of those workers' wages. And that's why buy right went down.
The same thing, the same dynamic that causes housing to increase is the same thing that causes wages to increase. When there is a scarcity of labor, wages will go up. And what creates a scarcity of labor is when there's a lot of jobs. If we had something, I can't speak to it with a lot of authority, but just as a matter of principle, expanding the ability to build more housing will create more job opportunities, and developers will be fighting to pay higher wages to people that are living in their cars and get them out of their cars. And it will lower the price of housing. So labor, I understand that the conventional wisdom is that wages are established by regulation. They're not. They're established by the market, just like everything else. And in fact, if we trued up what minimum wage should be in this country, it would be $22 an hour, and maybe we ought to do that. We ought to redistribute some money as well. What I've advocated for in Seattle is we take our levy and we, instead of funneling it through tax credit development, that we actually give cash to poor people. That's what poor people need, is money. They don't have enough of it. So I think that we could come to some agreement in the sense that more jobs means higher wages, and it means employers competing for workers rather than workers competing with each other.
I agree. Wages and earnings, and people being able to afford to live. And even in Oakland, people are getting displaced. They can't afford to live. In Richmond, they're getting pushed to places where they've lived forever.
And if I can add, Robbie, if you look at the LAO's second report on affordable housing, the bottom 25% of income earners in California are spending 67% of their take-home pay on housing costs.
I agree with you.
So unless we fix this problem collectively, raising the minimum wage to $50 an hour ain't going to matter, because the landlord will just jack up the price of the rent. Landlords were celebrating when the governor signed the minimum wage bill, because it's like, hey, it's a pass-through. We know we can charge more because there's a very small finite number of available units and an awful lot of people competing for them. We can charge more. Just between 2010 and 2015 in the Bay Area alone, we created 500,000 new jobs in 5 years and permitted 65,000 units of housing. And we asked, why is there a crisis? It's basic math. We're creating permitting levels of housing. If you look at Seattle, for example, Seattle's 25% smaller than San Francisco and has 50% more units in the pipeline. We are producing, as an economy in the Bay Area, levels of housing that are comparable to the Rust Belt compared to our population. We're at Cleveland, Buffalo, Gary, Indiana levels of housing production. But we are just last month, the San Jose MSA economic growth numbers came out, 8.3%. That puts China to shame. This is the fastest growing economy on the planet by orders of magnitude, but we're producing anemic numbers of housing units, and that's the crux of the problem.
So policymakers are clearly going to play a crucial role in helping to incentivize and develop supply, and you were just mentioning the permitting process. So let's deal with that, but in terms of streamlining or at least shortening the permitting processes, which are really kind of slowing down progress tremendously, even when you kind of even when there's a will. What can be done there? How do we make those permitting processes more efficient? Tom, I'm sure you've given an awful lot of thought to this.
Well, you've got a lot of laws, you've got a lot of regulations, and you have a tremendous amount of input from different stakeholders at the local level. The ideal situation would be to figure out a way to expedite building permits, expedite the entire entitlement process, but it's not an easy feat to do. To some degree, you find yourself with the state law that talks about housing accountability. And I think, as we heard at the last panel, that there is a housing element and there's requirements that are supposed to be made, but it kind of stops because there is no real enforcement. I don't know how you expedite the building permit process, the development process, without some sort of requirement placed on local government. I think there has to be greater teeth. I think you have local control, but I think to some degree the state's got to step in and they've got to put teeth in the process. And
What might that requirement look like?
well, I mean, everybody's supposed to allocate their fair share of housing, but we all know how that works. It's sort of like you sit around at the local governments and it's sort of like trading cards. Well, you take these 10, I'll take these 15, and they zone property that could be zoned for 30 units per acre, but they have no intentions of ever building on 30 units of acre. I think what you have to say is you have to enforce that, but you let local governments decide how they're going to do it. But I think the state's got to take a harder approach on this thing, and it's got to make the requirement that they've got to keep those housing elements enforced. Give the locals the ability to do it. Let them get creative, figure out how they do it. The state will hear that if the barriers are too strong, if the land use is all basically based upon economics, then come to the state and make the specific requests, but require the cities to actually get their fair share built. That way Robbie's folks build and you get more housing. I mean, not easy, but that'd be my recommendation.
Please.
Yeah, I concur with that. I think I was just talking to a developer yesterday who was telling me about 2 projects he has going on right now that are already correct. The projects are already consistent with the zoning for the site, and it's the design review process that is taking months and months and causing all kinds of hassle, and he's about threatening to sue to get his project through. And this is a site where the project is already consistent with the zoning in a city that has a compliant housing element in theory. And the design review process is supposed to be sort of ministerial. It's not something that's supposed to be able to trip up a project, but it does. I mean, so there's maybe even a low-hanging fruit. And design review in and of itself is a good thing, right? You want projects to look good. You want them to fit into the neighborhood, but it is being used in a way that can kill a project or at least delay it to death, and that needs to be addressed.
So, so in a crisis, you need to be creative too, right? And we talked earlier today about what role there is for these businesses who are looking to attract and retain the best talent. We heard about Facebook trying to build housing around near its headquarters. Is there more that successful growing companies can be doing to to subsidize their own employees, bring temporary relief, to kind of ease the crisis?
Yeah, we're working with Facebook. We met with them, and we actually helped the high-speed rail change their plans from building south from Fresno to go from Fresno up the peninsula to give a 1-hour commute, and we're helping finance and build 3,000 units in Fresno, which will be high-density, quality living for workers that are going to be in the Bay Area, because that's the future is transportation and affordable high-density housing, not building sprawl and not going as far as you can go. We've been involved in affordable housing 70 or 80 years. We have a AFL-CIO affordable housing fund. We built hundreds of projects around this state, and but it's going to take us all. But I do not believe the redevelopment agency's low-hanging fruit. It's the answer to the problem. When I said Herb West, and I didn't explain, he's LA City Council president, and he wants to protect the people in his community, but he still wants to build. Through the redevelopment agency, what they done was they got in between the community and the developer. They made sure that displaced people were taken care of, and they made sure it was a quality project build. They were actually a buffer for the developer, or the developer got eat alive, and they streamlined the process through the cities. They were a creation of 80 years of progressive urban planning, and they were wiped away. They're not the low-hanging fruit, they're the answer, and it's got to be there.
As the representative of those big employers, I'd like to first sort of express one cautionary sentiment, and I think it was expressed earlier. We have a system in the United States. Robbie and I, if you probably haven't noticed, come from the same part of the world, and we will be providing translations later. But
they understand.
I grew up in a system where, you know, I had a national health service, and I didn't have to rely, my parents didn't have to rely on their employer for their health care. It was a bit of an alien shock for me when I came to this country and discovered that my health care was dependent upon my employment. And that's a troubling thing for a lot of people. Imagine if your housing is dependent upon your employer as well. You lose your job, you lose your health care, you lose your home all in the same day. That's a rough day. So I think we need to be really careful about asking employers to provide housing for their employees. Asking employers to support sustainable sources of funding for affordable housing, absolutely. And at the Bay Area Council, our members just last week voted to support over $1 billion of affordable housing bonds in the Bay Area, the Alameda bond and the Santa Clara bond. And we supported Assemblymember Chu's tax credit last year. We supported, I see Zach Olmsted here from Speaker Atkins's office. We supported her bill for a dedicated funding source. Our members are not stingy when it comes to supporting funding for affordable housing. But I think just on a policy level, I think it's a dangerous precedent to set, to point to the business community and say, you need to provide housing for your employees. And then just on a practical level, I don't know why people think it would be easier for Facebook or Google or Apple or anyone else to walk into City Council and get approval when housing developers can't get approval. It's, you know, that the politics are going to be exactly the same for them as they're going to be for developers. And then I also get asked a lot, you know, why do market rate developers not build middle income product? Why do market rate developers not build affordable product? And the answer to that is, well, the example I like to use, there's a project in San Francisco in South Van Ness, which is being funded by the Mayor's Office of Housing, 100% affordable project. It's penciling out at $890,000 a unit. Now, if affordable developers can't build product for the middle part of the market rate developers aren't going to be able to do it either. So we need to fix that problem as well in order to, if we're to bring a lot more product to market, a lot more units to market, we need to figure out a way. And you know, and labor is a piece of it, but I don't think it's a backbreaking piece of it. I think it's the exactions that communities pull out of new housing projects because existing residents don't want to pay their fair share, and they stick it to the next person coming in, and that's what really drives up the costs. And I think there's agreement. Robbie's members want to build stuff. Our members want to build stuff. Everybody in this room wants to build stuff. I think we need to point the finger of blame at the people who don't want stuff built and find a political way to get past them. And that, unfortunately, in many instances, is local governments who are representing that sentiment. And find a way to get past them and get stuff built, because at the end of the day it's going to benefit Robbie's members, my members, and everybody in California who's struggling to pay the bills.
I would have, I mean, again, echoing that is really a critical thing. We don't ask employers to provide, a car or, a certain amount of calories of food or whatever. But, housing in this country, some people want it to be an entitlement. Even if we made housing, allocated, everybody is entitled to 750 square feet of housing. We would trade high prices for rationing. You'd get your 750 square feet 3 years from now, 10 miles from where you want it, staring at a brick wall. So we have a market for a reason, and the market absorbs the risk and gets the reward. And that can take care of the vast majority of the housing demand. When you get down to people who are poor, they pay a higher percentage of their income for housing, but they pay a higher percentage of their income for health care, for daycare, for gasoline, for everything else. What they need is either cash subsidies or higher wages. So we're putting the burden on housing to sort of solve an economic problem at the lower ends of the economic ladder that really is not about housing, it's about just not having enough income, not having enough upward mobility in the economy.
Mark?
I think there are two other roles for employers, though, besides providing the housing directly, which again I think is probably not the best solution. But number one, the housing entitlement is largely a political process, and the corporations are respected political voices in the community. Whether it's San Francisco or Mountain View or even Sacramento, when the employers show up to support different housing developments, right now the issue is that only the NIMBYs show up. No one else is in support. If the corporations show up in support, as well as the residents and the people who want new housing, that actually changes the dynamic, and it makes it a lot easier to political officials to say yes. And secondarily, there's a role for, I mean, some corporations in the state do have a lot of profit, not all, and many are struggling, but you know, the Googles and Facebooks of the world have quite a bit of capital, it seems, and they don't need to build the housing, but they can help provide some of that subsidy that makes housing affordable. You know, the state has disinvested, the federal government has disinvested, and there's no way corporations are going to make that up, and I'm not suggesting they should be forced to, but they can be a part of the solution as well, and I think there's a good role for them to play, at least those who have that kind of capacity.
Is there any risk, maybe there's a risk in asking this question, is there any risk of overreacting as we are working to address this shortage now? I mean, housing is a notoriously cyclical market. And less than a decade ago, our concern was the collapse of prices. So is there any risk of overreacting?
I would say no. I mean, we have built half the housing we've needed for 3 decades. And even the foreclosure crisis, it wasn't that we still had enough housing. Those families moved out of homes because they couldn't afford them, but they moved in with somebody else. They didn't have their own housing. I mean, ultimately, we really need drastic solutions. It's not been easy to come by them, but you know, even the small hanging fruit is not really going to get us there. We are so far from being where we need to be. We're short 1.5 million affordable units. We're short millions of even market rate units, and it's so far from being at equilibrium that I don't think anything should be off the table.
It's a funny question because my initial reaction is yes, because I think that we don't have a good definition for it. And in Seattle, I think we are overreacting. I mean, the reaction to an 8% increase year over year in prices has been to, again, impose taxes on housing as a way of creating more tax credit, you know, sort of inefficiently produced housing that's subsidized. And so in our world, I think we are sort of pushing the panic button, and we're actually creating things like mandatory inclusionary zoning. If our local guys could do it, they would do rent control. They would do a bunch of really bad ideas, are already in the middle of doing lots of bad ideas. And they would just go crazy with those things, kind of hitting the button, panicking about the housing crisis when there's not really a good, I mean, how do you measure crisis? At what point quantitatively do you reach crisis? I mean, there's no measure for it. There's no measure for displacement. There's no measure for a lot of these things. I think California, though, probably has crossed over into the realm of, I don't think you can overcompensate. So, and that's sadly where Seattle is going, is down the road of San Francisco, where you're seeing prices go up, and the reaction is to do things that will make prices worse.
You know, I want to clarify. So when I said we're working with Facebook and these guys, is to provide infrastructure so that housing can be built further out. Mm-hmm. We're not asking them, and we're not subsidizing that, but if we don't give the ability of somebody to get 40 minutes away from work with mass transit, then they're stuck in an area driving up costs.
It's not just about supply, it's about
the supply. Yeah. And you know, I'll go back to buy ride. I think buy ride is very doable, but it's got to be on the table. It cannot be ran through without everyone at the table to figure out how to make it work. It was ran through at the end of the year. It didn't go through all the committees, and there was a lot of agendas there. We look at these affordable housing projects, and if a project costs $100 million, the labor is 10% of that. The fees with the people with the suits are 12%. So every plumber, electrician, roofer, and everybody that's on that job, all of our labor together is 10% of a $100 million project. 40% of that is soft costs, 60% of that is the hard costs of the material and all of the things, including the land. So we are not the problem. The working blue-collar worker is not the problem. And the answer is not to drive us into the ground to sleep in our cars to build affordable housing that the 400,000 people that I represent can be ran over like that. So that's one of the reasons I had the young lady there wanted to know why unions were against it. That's why we were against it. and we think we can come back to the table and solve those issues, but we are not the cost. 10%, that's the labor. Thank you.
Betsy, may I just add a little flavor to what Robbie said? And it's something that you said struck me, and it's something Mia said earlier as well about cows and lawsuits. I sit on ABAG's Regional Planning Committee. That's the Association of Bay Area Governments. That's where regional planning runs into the buzzsaw of local control. That's where everybody fights about implementing Plan Bay Area and densifying. And so I'm sort of privy to a lot of wonkish statistics. 170,000 people a day drive into the Bay Area from homes in the Central Valley. And these are the homes Robbie talked about that are, you know, stick frame, low quality, built by, you know, non-union labor. And because development follows the path of least resistance. And those almond orchards and those cows out there don't file CEQA lawsuits. And we're forcing our lowest income workers into those 2-hour commutes every day. We're forcing those people to drive over the Altamont Pass, those teachers and caregivers and retail workers, to drive over the Altamont Pass 2 hours every day in the morning, 2 hours every day at night, that they're away from their families, they're not helping their kids with homework, and it just perpetuates cycles of poverty and degradation. So one idea, and it was mentioned earlier in one of the previous panels, when we passed AB 32, we put a mechanism in called cap and trade. So big polluters, oil refineries and cement factories have to, you know, buy credits and pay for their pollution. When we passed SB 375 and told local communities you have to reduce your greenhouse gas production from vehicle miles traveled by doing densification and infill, we put no mechanism in place. There's no teeth, as you said, Tom, there's no teeth in the process to force cities to do that. So I'm sort of kicking the tires of an idea of what about cap and trade for housing?
Well, just to say, the 3,000 units in Fresno are using partial cap and trade money, so that's a component of what's happening.
Yeah, but if Palo Alto, imagine a city planning commission meeting in Palo Alto where the neighbors were told, if you oppose that project, it's going to cost each one of you $5,000 because we're going to have to pay into a regional housing trust fund to cover the cost of our teachers and our retail workers. And so that's the decision you have to make: stay leafy and suburban or pay $5,000. Your call. Right now, there's no trade-off. They get to say no to the project and walk away. And there are zero ramifications. But if you put a fiscal ramification, teeth, into the process, cap and trade might not be the answer. It might be something else.
Tom?
But something has to be put in place.
I mean, to some degree, it does go back to the fair share issue. And you're right, if the people in Palo Alto, and you know, I think there's some people here from Palo Alto, excuse me, but whether it's cost you money, whether it's hard dollars, or whether it's, and don't everybody shoot me, I said this 20 years ago in a realtor group, almost got killed. Why do you give a mortgage interest deduction to those, the entire mortgage interest deduction to those communities, people that live there, where they're putting barriers to anybody else coming in? I mean, there's a real question here about equity. I mean, you know, if you want to build a wall, there's a cost.
So we are just about out of time, and I want to just end with giving you all the opportunity to have one wish granted, just as a way of getting you to sort of identify a real priority. Imagine the state of California grants you one wish on housing. What one thing would you ask for that you think would make the greatest difference? Roger, I'm going to start with you.
I go back to, you know, I think what Tom said and what's been brought up just recently, which is putting teeth into it and I think what has to happen is you have to take away the local control, and you have to, as much as I don't like mandates, I think what you'd have to do is come up with a quantitative, I mean, I think the LAO's numbers are fantastic and very well done. You just have to look at those and say, you're going to have to build these many units, and if you don't, we're going to impose some really onerous, you know, financial impact on the residents of that community that will make the scales tip so that having that housing there will be better than the alternative. I think anything short of that at this point, you know, you're just never going to get there by allowing local elected officials to make those decisions.
Mark?
I'm going to rely on my colleagues to stimulate the private market. And so I'm going to say that, you know, I think we do need a renewed state and local and federal investment at all levels of government to make sure that we're also serving those folks who the market will never be able to get to.
Okay, Matt?
Yeah, just following on from what Roger said, I mean, in the Bay Area, we have, as part of Plan Bay Area, we have a process where cities apply for priority development status, and they get planning funding to create PDAs, priority development areas, and where they're supposed to upzone, and then developers come with compliant projects, and those cities say no. They've already taken regional planning dollars to create these zones, and the developers work to make sure that their projects are compliant with those zoning and development area plans, and they're told no. So either we have a carrot approach or we have a stick approach. Under the current budgetary situation, I don't think there's money for carrots, so there has to be a stick. And whatever that stick is, be it cap and trade, be it taking discretionary transportation dollars away from cities, whatever it happens to be, we need to find a mechanism to make the decisions that are made at the local level painful. When they do the wrong thing, those decisions have to come with some pain. And I'll leave it up to the local government experts to decide what those thresholds are and what those mechanisms are. But right now there's no pain. It's too easy to say no. We need to make it harder.
Robbie, your one wish from the state of California on housing.
That we build infrastructure like the BART Fund or the high-speed rail or transit to allow, because you're never going to build affordable housing in San Francisco. 800,000 a unit. And you just can't do it. So you're going to have to give a workforce a fast, clean way of getting to somewhere decent to live, high density, transit-oriented development. We should be working hard on that.
And Tom?
I just say what I said earlier, let's put some teeth in the state law and give local governments the creativity to achieve whatever that requirement is.
All right. Well, I want to thank you panelists for your time, for your insight. I want to thank the California Apartment Association for convening this forum. There's going to be a report soon on the key findings of this forum, and really thank you to this audience for joining us today and for your enthusiasm and participation. Thank you and have a great afternoon.
Thank you. Thanks. Thank you.